Welcome to the Personality Couch podcast, where we discuss all things personality and clinical practice. I'm your host, Doc Bach, and I'm here with my co-host, Doc Fish. We are both licensed clinical psychologists in private practice, and today we are continuing our series on schizoid personality. We are tackling a frequently asked and much debated question about schizoid versus avoidant personality. In this episode, we will unpack the controversy around these types and give our thoughts and opinions about if they should be the same or if, in fact, they are different. Let's dive in.
We need to start with definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. So we are talking about the DSM definitions of avoidant versus schizoid personality disorder.
Yep.
Both are pervasive by early adulthood and present in multiple areas of life.
Yes. And just a quick recap on schizoid. Per the DSM, there has to be a pattern of social detachment and restricted emotional expression, plus 4 or more criteria involving not wanting, enjoying, and or lacking close relationships, lack of interest in sexual experiences, choosing solitary activities, not taking pleasure in things, appearing indifferent to praise or criticism, and showing emotional coldness, detachment, or flattened affectivity. Also, there's no psychosis or autism.
Right. And then for avoidant, the DSM defines avoidant personality disorder as a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation, plus 4 or more criteria involving avoidance of social contact, even at work, due to fears of and or preoccupation with criticism or rejection, avoidance of new situations and or risk to prevent embarrassment, and because of feeling inadequate, socially inept, and inferior, avoidance of participating in social situations unless certain of being liked, and holding back in relationships due to a fear of being shamed.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's go to the history. So this part is really interesting to me. Unlike other personality disorders that have origins dating back to the early 1900s or even before, avoidant personality disorder did not come on the scene until the 1960s. It wasn't until 1969 that Milan suggested it, and it didn't actually show up formally in the DSM until the DSM-3 in 1980.
In the DSM-3, they actually split schizoid personality disorder into avoidant, schizotypal, and schizoid. And ever since, they've been arguing about it.
Of course they have been. Yeah. So in the 1980s, how do you suppose personality theorists and shrinks argued?
Why, they wrote letters back and forth to each other in journals. So I found about 8 theorists and their associates commenting on the split of schizoid and avoidant in the American Journal of Psychiatry from about 1985 to 1989.
That is so fascinating and funny. So these are angry letters to each other in a professional way. Yeah.
They were.
What were they arguing about, Doc Fish?
The main argument was how schizoid and avoidant were split up in the actual DSM, as some, I think rightly, complained that the DSM categories overlapped too much and were too vague to highlight the different disorders. But that also led to a deeper argument about whether schizoid and avoidant should conceptually be split up in general.
Ooh, yes. And some theorists thought that they were 2 different flavors of the same core personality, kind of similar to vulnerable and grandiose narcissism. Some theorists thought that avoidant and schizoid were 2 sides of the same personality coin.
Exactly. And here I think is a good place to introduce Kretschmer, who describes schizoid personalities as having 3 groups of characteristics. So the first is being unsociable, quiet, reserved, serious, and eccentric. Now, he suggested that this first group of features is the core of schizoid and, quote, runs like a scarlet thread through the whole of schizoid characterology.
That's interesting. Yeah. So the second is being timid, shy with delicate feelings, sensitive, nervous, excitable, and fond of nature and books. He called this hyperasthesia, capturing sensitivity or oversensitivity. Okay, so then we have the third one, and that's being pliable, kindly, honest, indifferent, dull-witted, and silent. He called this anesthesia, capturing the coldness or insensitivity of these individuals.
So he put the second and third groups of features on a continuum, noting that the sensitivity and insensitivity stand in opposition to each other, and that schizoids can move along the spectrum, making their position unstable. So the tension between the two is what is distressing. It is a conflict.
Ding, ding, ding. Yes. Schizoid is characterized by an internal conflict according to psychodynamic.
Now, Kretschmer stated, quote, "The majority of schizoids are neither oversensitive nor cold, but they are oversensitive and cold at the same time, and in quite different relative proportions."
Very interesting. Yes. So the first strand of the schizoid personality in his theory is the observable characteristics. So being quiet, reserved, possibly eccentric. And then the next two strands are the internal stuff, which exist on a continuum where the schizoid feels conflict. Like basically, I'm very sensitive, but I come across as cold as a result, both to varying degrees depending on the person.
Yes, so the sensitivity and insensitivity exist within the same turtle. Like it's just how comfortable or safe the turtle feels that determines where it's at on that sensitivity continuum.
Right. But then Milan came in and was like, it's not a continuum. These are two separate personalities. So he attributes hyperasthesia to avoidant personalities, described as timid, withdrawn, and sensitive, and then anesthesia to asocial personalities who are affectionless and insensitive.
Now, asocial was used because Milan didn't want to use the word schizoid here to describe the deficits of insensitivity and indifference. He really wanted to use the word asocial. He thought using the word schizoid was like too confusing and inaccurate, which I agree with, kind of explains some things.
Aha, very interesting. So because of what schizoid had historically been versus what it was watered down to become in the DSM. Yeah. But he ended up losing his argument for asocial, and of course, it still became the schizoid that we know in the DSM. So now, cue the arguing.
Okay. So some argued that Kretschmer should have split up the sensitivity continuum to be more like subtypes, like Milan did, while others argued that it should stay on a continuum.
Right. And then, of course, some cited our overall problems with classifying personality into categories in the DSM, because as we know, personalities don't fit neatly into boxes. Akhtar then noted that the work of Fairburn and Kernberg were ignored in splitting up avoidant and schizoid.
Right. So he actually highlighted that schizoids use lower level defenses like splitting, resulting in identity diffusion and a borderline organization, while avoidants use higher level defenses like repression, symbolism, and displacement that do not result in any identity diffusion. He actually noted that avoidant personality is a neurotic organization and is a personality of phobic neurosis, like of anxiety.
That is interesting. I can see that. Yeah. So Akhtar is saying that schizoid is a borderline level of organization and avoidant is a neurotic level of organization. So basically, it's just a different way to categorize personality health.
So then Akhtar went on to point out that childhood trauma, ego deficits, and problems with the self in relation to others make schizoid more severe than avoidant at the disorder level. And then he later basically said that in avoidant personality disorder, the anxiety is ego-syntonic. So it becomes one with the person and the personality. And so all of the anxiety, it's like an all-encompassing trait.
I can absolutely see that. Yes, yes. But meanwhile, Milan was like, excuse me, y'all weren't on the DSM task force, so you're missing data and you're wrong. So flexing his muscle, right? And then other theorists said, well, there's not many schizoids, so maybe we should just delete it from the DSM. And then Akhtar chimed in again and wanted to delete schizoid and keep avoidant, but then relabel avoidant as schizoid, because that's not confusing, right? It's personality chaos, basically. So no wonder we're still confused about these personality types.
So what was actually agreed upon? We know that there is a clear overlap between schizoid and avoidant, but let's talk about what that is. So overall, they are both detached personalities. So they move away from people and they lean towards an avoidant or dismissive attachment style. They're introverted and socially isolated and can come across as chilly, socially awkward, or socially backward.
So while they're both highly sensitive, they often struggle in intimate relationships. They both avoid others out of fear, but the fear is from different origins. Criticism for the avoidant and intrusion for the schizoid. Yeah. But I think we need to get into the differences though, because there's a lot more of these. And this can actually get pretty confusing. So we made a table for the blog. So we'll link that in the show notes if you need a visual to follow along. So as we discuss these differences, Doc Fish, why don't you take schizoid and I'll take avoidant and we'll compare and contrast. Does that sound all right?
Sounds great. So the first difference is that schizoids have low attachment anxiety, where they are just basically detached. But notably, someone did say that if a schizoid loses a main attachment, they can feel extremely lost. Now, lost isn't anxious, though.
Yeah. And then avoidants have excessive investment in interpersonal relationships to keep from rejection and humiliation. Yeah.
Schizoids experience social anhedonia, or obtaining limited or no joy from relationships, so they don't really respond as much socially.
And then in contrast, avoidants have social hypervigilance, which is anxiety about relationships to keep attachments secure or to keep from being criticized. So they're actually hyper attuned and very responsive to the relationship and what's happening versus being indifferent like the schizoid.
Now, a schizoid has a low need to belong. This is more about indifference, like they don't really care if you like them.
Yeah, versus avoidants have a high need to belong, like love me, don't criticize me, approve of me.
Then schizoids have a glass plate dynamic where their connection is limited by a barrier. So like they can see through it, you can see them, but it's really, really hard to actually join in with a schizoid and vice versa. It's a passive detachment. And while they maybe can come off as kind of passive aggressive, it's not a defining feature. And it's probably actually like their actual aggression, like a turtle yelling at you.
I can see that. Yeah. And then avoidants have what is called a chase dodge dynamic, or essentially a push pull feel to their relationship, or like, come here, go away, due to anxiety. And they can be very passive aggressive too. So you can see that in this dynamic as well.
Schizoids have decreased empathetic expression. So the emotion is on the inside, but it's not necessarily shown on the outside.
And then avoidants have high fear-based shyness and timidity. And I actually think maybe you could see this in a schizoid with social anxiety disorder who's trying to like pop out of the turtle shell and connect. However, any social detachment of the avoidant here is really due to fear of criticism, right? Making them seem docile and shy.
And then schizoids have diminished or constricted affect. So again, their facial expressions are muted, possibly because their emotions are more split off and possibly because they protect against their emotions more.
And then avoidants have negative affectivity or neuroticism. So avoidants can actually be quite grumpy at times and irritable with flavors of negativistic personality. So sometimes you see their neurotic energy arising from fear of humiliation.
Now, schizoids have neither positive nor negative self-regard. Again, there can be an indifference towards the self, but there's no shame.
Exactly. Yeah. But in contrast, avoidants have negative self-regard and internalized shame. So shame fuels their hypervigilance. They actually avoid others to minimize anxiety against their fears of rejection and criticism, even though they desire approval from others. I actually think this is one of the biggest differences between schizoid and avoidant, like that view of self. But that's going to be hard to see outside of close relationships or therapy because the behavior can look very similar that's stemming from that.
I agree. And schizoids have neither high nor low self-efficacy and self-agency. Again, there's an indifference or a middle ground here. Like there's no difficulty with these things.
Versus avoidants have low self-efficacy and low self-agency. So low self-esteem, basically. And they don't really recognize their own power to make the changes that they need to in their lives because they may not feel worthy. So again, it comes back to this negative self-view.
Then schizoids have low antagonism. So they don't prefer to engage in conflict. It's too much energy. The conflict goes around the schizoid.
And then avoidants have low disinhibition. So what does this mean? It means that they inhibit or restrain their impulses and emotions for fear of rejection, which makes them passive aggressive. So their anger or antagonism does come out, but it's sideways because it's suppressed.
Then for schizoids, psychodynamic treatment usually works better and is used to work on the self in relation to others.
And in contrast, avoidants respond well to cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT to work on that fear in relation to others.
Schizoids protect their existence against others possibly like consuming, impinging, or engulfing them.
Versus avoidants protect against others hurting, criticizing, or rejecting them and poking at their internalized shame.
One article said that schizoids have a well-defended detachment. So they build a castle wall, they don't have those negative emotions, and they don't give people a clue about what they're guarding.
Very interesting. Yes. But in contrast, avoidants have a poorly defended attachment. So it's almost like a straw house. It's unstable because of that negative affectivity, right? So sometimes that grumpiness or that negativity, you can sometimes get a little peek at what they're guarding, shame, due to those increased reactions and negative mood.
So schizoids isolate from others. They wall themselves off. There's that glass plate in between them. They shut down. They don't expect social reciprocity. They're walling off their needs and finding contentment in like aloneness or loneliness. And there's often a diminished search for intimacy.
Avoidants, in contrast, do not really isolate from others, though they may keep them at a safe distance or engage in that sort of chase, dodge, or push-pull dynamic. They do maintain hope or an expectation that social reciprocity is possible, but they insulate just in case of painful rejection and interpersonal failures. So what does the DSM have to say, though, about the differences? So the DSM's differential diagnoses for avoidant and schizoid states that while both are characterized by social isolation, those with avoidant personality disorder want to have relationships with others and feel their loneliness deeply, whereas those with schizoid personality disorder may be content with and even prefer the social isolation.
It also says that social isolation in avoidant personality disorder stems from a fear of being embarrassed or found inadequate and excessive anticipation of rejection. Then in contrast, schizoid personality disorder involves a more pervasive detachment and limited desire for social intimacy.
Right. Yes. Yes. Okay. So we laid out the facts here about what overlaps and then the differences, but I think we need to talk about our thoughts and opinions here. So as we're doing that, my first question to you, Doc Fish, is why in the world are we so late in coining avoidant personality disorder? Like that is the piece that sticks out to me here. Like why not earlier? This personality disorder, its origins are way, way, way later than any other personality disorder that we've come across thus far. So the fact that early psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theorists missed avoidant personality disorder is interesting to me. So I want to talk about why and what your thoughts are. And, if it is different from schizoid, then like, why did we miss it?
Okay, so I think maybe in part we missed it because psychodynamic considered it to be part of schizoid personalities, and they never actually really accepted the DSM-3 split of schizoid into schizoid, schizotypal, and avoidant.
Right. Yeah. So they consider the schizotypal and avoidant to be just different flavors of schizoid. So this is similar to Kretschmer. Yeah.
Then the DSM criteria of schizoid and avoidant are still too vague and overlapping. There's research on that. They're not quite sufficient to capture like a genuine distinction.
But Milan seemingly had to have his claim to fame by coining this disorder. That sticks out to me.
And then if we truly separate avoidant personality based on the core internal experiences of things like defenses, neuroticism, that chase-dodge dynamic, we kind of start to see that avoidant is more similar to the anxious avoidant or phobic personalities that were described in psychodynamic instead of the schizoid personality.
Interesting. So if I'm hearing you correctly, do you think that psychodynamic, gasp, maybe got it wrong too?
It's possible. Okay. But let's be like super clear because this is so confusing. I personally think, and I can always be wrong, I think the DSM schizoid and the DSM avoidant are too similar to be put into different categories.
Fair.
It's almost like the DSM schizoid describes the turtle shell and the DSM avoidant describes some of those processes that might exist inside the turtle. Then psychodynamic captures both the DSM schizoid and DSM avoidant under schizoid because it sees both as the full turtle. And that does make sense to me.
That's really interesting. I think we did get some feedback at the beginning of our series saying we were describing avoidant much more than schizoid by showcasing the psychodynamic conceptualization of schizoid. And given our discussion here, that makes sense.
Exactly. There's so many different perspectives in psychology and different people argue different things. But in my opinion, I would differentiate schizoid and avoidant way more clearly.
Yeah.
I do think schizoid should encompass all of the psychoanalytic processes of schizoid, like maybe keep Kretschmer's continuum of that sensitivity regarding how far the turtle comes in and out of its shell. Plus there's like different kinds of turtles and some are more sociable or sensitive than others.
Sure.
So maybe like, I don't know, throw out the DSM schizoid description because it kind of sucks.
Yes, you've been saying that this whole series. Yes. And I agree. It's not great. Yeah. But I'm hoping you can tell me a little more. I know you have more to say.
Always. So then I describe avoidant as a psychoanalytic anxious avoidant or phobic personality. So it's not quite a turtle. It's a hare, a bunny. Like they're always on guard against threat. They run really fast away from danger, but they also hide in their like lovely, like cozy bunny homes with other bunnies because they really do want connection.
Uh-huh.
So they're sociable but fearful.
I can
They
see that.
actually scope out a bolt location where they can easily and quickly run to when they're feeling danger.
Aha, I can see this. I can see what you're thinking about here. Yeah, so you're saying two different species who are fearful in some type of way, but for different reasons and who cope with it like way differently.
So basically, both personalities move away from others. But schizoid fears engulfment or intrusion, and the avoidant fears humiliation.
Yeah.
But what do you think, Doc Bach?
Well, I mean, firstly, I like what you have to say here. I think you might be onto something, like maybe putting it in a different category from psychodynamic. Like, I think that's a possibility. But then there's another part of me that is honestly really not quite sure what to think about avoidant personality disorder. I have a lot of conflicting thoughts and opinions here. So the piece that continually sticks out to me is the late origins of it. Like, I'm really skeptical about it being so late and being in the 1960s versus other personality disorders that have way, way, way more research and time to make sure that they're actually legit. And with that, I think we have to look at the cultural and socio-political factors that maybe contributed to Milan's seeing this like hypersensitive trait being a full-blown personality disorder.
Okay, so this is an interesting train of thought. So you think perhaps avoidant as a trait that could be part of multiple types of personalities?
That's what I'm wondering. I'm curious about it. I'm not sold on it yet, but I want to kind of explore it more as I learn more and research more about it. But I can't help but consider the context here. So like 1960s, right? Let's remember what that time was like. I wasn't born yet, but in the 1960s, World War II was not that long ago. Boomers are born or coming of age. JFK was assassinated in 1963. And in America, which Milan was an American psychologist, that was the height of the civil rights movement. And then the war in Vietnam escalated. Nixon, a very, very fearful personality, was elected as president in 1969. Multiple theorists have said he's a paranoid personality structure. Anyway, even though I wasn't there in the 1960s to be able to say, from what I know about it, it was a time of a lot of anxiety and a lot of upheaval and political upheaval as well. So one of my questions is it possible that Milan was capturing a rabbit-like fear-based personality trait that was so prevalent in that time frame?
I think that's very possible. It makes me wonder too if Milan was maybe an avoidant personality, because researchers love to research their own internal dynamics.
Don't they?
I think it's also possible that Milan had a hole in his theory where he needed to find a dichotomous categorization for detached personalities. So he came up with avoidant to fill that hole, or maybe just saw an opportunity to make his mark on the field.
Yeah, very possible. He perhaps did have more of an egotistical streak, as unfortunately many shrinks often do. But I'm also wondering if this shame-filled, hypersensitive to rejection trait can be a part of other personalities. So for example, one could argue that borderline personality disorder has a strong avoidant flavor, right? The go away, the push pull, but then they flip that switch to dependent. Like, come here, come here, come here. I love you. Don't leave me.
I've actually seen that pattern on MCMI profiles a lot with borderline personality disorder. So that's interesting. Along the lines of the MCMI, so that's Milan's measure of personality, there's high overlap between schizoid and avoidant scales. And I also can't help but wonder if maybe avoidant could overlap with like a negativistic or passive aggressive personality too.
Yes. Okay. So I see what you're saying here. Yeah. And that made me think on the MCMIs that I have seen, sometimes that negativistic trait is also elevated, or that passive aggressive trait. So there's some overlap here among these personalities, at least in regard to Milan's theory and his personality measures. So yeah. And then I also think of like avoidant types being passive aggressive and even bitter because they're trying to hide their shame. But anyway, I'm just not sure about this one. I feel like I have more questions than I have answers about avoidant personality disorder, especially that late recognition. Like that really sticks out to me. But I mean, that said, I have diagnosed it clinically and I've seen presentations that, quote, check the DSM boxes and have confidently made that diagnosis as a result. But then I think of something else, and that's that avoidant personality disorder is often taught, and it was taught to me in school as an extreme version of social anxiety disorder or social phobia, but it's to the extreme, right? So then it kind of becomes integrated with the personality. So it becomes all pervasive and all encompassing, significantly affecting relationships. So we call this ego syntonic, right? The anxiety is one with the personality. But I'm wondering if certain structures maybe are prone to these avoidant traits, but perhaps any personality can have them. I don't know.
Okay. So you're saying that the anxiety is ego syntonic. So it's turned in, versus like ego dystonic, like a disc I think of, like you throw it out. So you can just have anxiety on the outside, but the avoidant is anxiety that's within the personality.
Yes.
Okay. So that makes me think of like obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So that technically is OCD intertwined with the personality.
Turned inward.
We also used to have depressive personality disorder and previous DSMs, appendices. Milan also has melancholic, but that's depression. That's ego syntonic. It's not like outside. It's within the personality. So it would make sense that we maybe could have an ego syntonic, anxious personality, but also avoidant traits could just be that. Like I'm thinking it makes sense as humans. I don't think most of us like to be rejected or humiliated.
Yeah.
So there could be a social thread throughout many personalities with that. I really think it's worth focusing on like the root of where personalities stem from.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you bring up some really, really interesting points here, Doc Fish. Yeah. So then my question is like, okay, is this avoidant personality trait a common thread in all of us that can get a bit extreme, right? So that's what's making me question it. Like, and then the time period in which it was coined. Like, think about if we coined a new personality disorder right now in 2025, when we're recording this podcast in this post-pandemic landscape, one that highlighted hypersensitivity and anxiety. Later researchers would probably raise an eyebrow at us, right? Because taking a sample of the clinical population now is very different than in years past. Like, we're on guard right now. We're hypervigilant. We're despondent. We're polarized. Like, I like to think of it, if we take a random ladle full of personalities from the personality soup, it's going to come up with more anxiety, fear, and hypervigilance than in other decades. Like, my question is, would this personality disorder that we coined today withstand the test of time?
Ooh, okay. I like where you're headed with this. So one thought I had is in like when those theorists were going back and forth in the journal and arguing, one argument was the sample size of the avoidant personality disorders. It was small. It was like in the 80s. So we're taking a ladle.
Oh,
yeah.
That is really small. Yes.
It is. So there's that. Then I'm also thinking maybe about how histrionic came from a time period of high female restriction. And so now maybe avoidant comes from an anxious socio-political time period.
Right. But with histrionic, even though the name sucks, we'll get to that one in another in another series. That one, historically, we've been able to test. Yeah.
I think it was just so much more prevalent because of the time period.
Exactly. Similar to paranoid personality, which is arguably been more present since the pandemic, but like coining a personality disorder without a whole lot of research and without the historical research and just taking a very polarized time in history of upheaval and anxiety, I'm actually suspicious about this personality disorder, similar to if we coined a new personality disorder right now in this exact moment, given everything that's happened in our world recently. But that said, I am open to new data. We do have an avoidant personality disorder series in the works, so perhaps my viewpoint will change as I learn more, because I'm always open to learning more. But I also am really curious what our listeners and viewers think. So we presented the data and the research as well as our own opinions, but I want to hear your thoughts. Doc Fish wants to hear your thoughts. Like, let us know in the comments, is avoidant personality disorder different from schizoid, or is it part of it? Should it even be a thing? Should it just be a trait? Should we consider cultural things or not in the making of this diagnosis? Let us know.
And I did want to bring up that regardless of label, so no matter what you named it, you're an individual with individual treatment and growth needs. So your journey does not depend on what psychologists or psychiatrists argue about.
It's so true. That's so true. Yeah. Regardless of what we call it, your experience and your symptoms are important. Like, never mind the shrinks arguing in the background over here, right?
They're always going to.
Always. Very opinionated. Anywho, we went deep as usual, and I honestly have more questions than answers about schizoid versus avoidant, if they should be the same thing under schizoid or different things or a trait. I don't even know. So personality is super complicated, and we shrinks have disagreed about it for like ever, which is why we made this podcast dedicated to talking about the deep end of the personality pool.
And don't forget to let us know if there's something in that deep end of the personality pool that you want to know more about.
Absolutely. We'll do the heavy lifting. Okay. So on that note, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us today on this episode of The Personality Couch. Make sure to check out our blogs that coincide with these episodes at www.personalitycouch.com. And as always, don't forget to give us a thumbs up or rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. And on YouTube, hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode of our Schizoid personality series. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you next time on The Personality Couch. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute a professional relationship. If you're in need of professional help, please seek out appropriate resources in your area. Information about clinical trends or diagnoses are discussed in broad and universal terms and do not refer to any specific person or case.